Good evening. Welcome to the Bradford County Historical Society's online Friday Night at the Museum program. This is Matt Carl, and right now during this COVID-19 situation, since we're unable to have on-site programs, we're going to do an online program this month. So the program we are going to be doing is one that we presented back in 2012 during the bicentennial of the county, and it was very popular back then, and we've had requests for it over the years, and so we're going to do it again tonight, and that is The Unusual Story of the Courthouse Square. This was a program that was first done in courtroom number 1 during the bicentennial celebration in the summer of 2012, and so we hope you enjoy learning a little bit about the courthouse square tonight. If you appreciate this kind of programming, we would invite you to click on the link to our website, and there on the main page of our website is a place that you can click and make a donation using a credit card or through PayPal, and we just appreciate your contribution. Normally at Friday Night at the Museum, we have a donation can, and that helps us with our operation. We also would like to thank the United Way of Bradford County for sponsoring our Friday Night at the Museum programming for this season and making it possible for us to switch to do this online programming in this way as well. So thank you again to the United Way of Bradford County for your support. In 1812, the bill to organize Bradford County was approved by the governor, and this was important because up to this time, although there had been the borders of a county called Ontario created, the court system and business still had to be transacted in Luzerne County. And so at this point in time, in 1812, the people of Bradford County were interested in conducting their own affairs and having their own court, and so that was why this was necessary to create Bradford County. The act stated that on the second Tuesday of October, 1812, its organization should take effect, and the county officers should be elected. At that election, Joseph Kinney, Justice Gaylord, and William Meyer were elected commissioners, and among other officers elected was Abner C. Rockwell, sheriff. On January 22nd, 1813, Sheriff Rockwell was appointed to build a jail made of logs on his property, and elections and other county business were already being done there. So these are some pictures of that first property where the sheriff was conducting business. The picture of the house is there, and that house is still located in Monroeton, right across the bridge. And the jail itself was located in a building made of logs that was on the bank of that property shown in the picture there to the right. That house was not used as the jail. It was the log building that was built there that was used for that purpose, and that was the county's first jail. One of the first tasks to be completed by the new commissioners was the establishment of a county seat near the center of the county. And so there were different opinions on where people thought this should be located. It had to be central to the county so that people traveling from the outskirts of the county could all travel approximately the same distance. But where exactly that would be located in the central part of the county was kind of important. So this is a map showing what the people on what is now the Wysox side of the Susquehanna thought should be done as far as a county seat. They drew up a map showing a town that would be called New Baltimore, and this would be laid out in the open field behind where the Dandy Mini Mart Pilot Mansion is now, and that would be called New Baltimore. And you can see the streets are laid out perfectly with city blocks and houses. The public square would be in the middle where the courthouse would likely be. And so people on that side of the river thought that would be a great idea. They thought it would bring business to that area. It was kind of a crossroads anyway, and still is today, with highways coming in from all different directions. But the people on the Towanda side of the river had a different idea, and they believed that the courthouse should be located on that side in Meansville, in what is now Towanda, and they thought that that would be the better plan because, again, businesses would be drawn to that part of the county instead. So this ultimately had to be decided in court because there was a disagreement between the two, and the court decided that the county seat would be located on what is now the Towanda side of the Susquehanna River. So a site on the western side of the Susquehanna was chosen and purchased from Thomas Overton, and the deed to the courthouse square was made out on April 21st, 1813, and this is a copy of that deed that is located in the deed books. Now, since there was a disagreement over the name of the town at the time, the county town was described as being located in Overton. Quote, said tract of land is in the said town of Overton, now the county town of Bradford, which said 2 acres of land are now conveyed to the above-named commissioners for public use as a public square on which to erect public buildings, end quote. So at that time, there was a disagreement over what to call that particular town. Meansville was one option, and Overton was the option that was used in this description, but of course we know Towanda is what it ultimately became. So officials immediately began discussing the need to build temporary offices on the grounds for the commissioners and the prothonotary. Proposals were requested for the project, and on May 6th, the contract was awarded to Austin Fowler. He soon became ill, and the project was then given to Joseph Elliott, who was to be paid $335. The office, a log building, was finished on August 3rd, and officials moved in on August 4th. Construction of the first courthouse was begun in 1814. It was a wooden frame structure 30 by 40 feet, located just off the southeast corner of the present courthouse, and it was built by Peter Egner of Northumberland. Now, this was located approximately where the brick annex building is for the courthouse now, where the elections office and those offices are located. And so the courthouse at that time was built on that corner of the courthouse square. The building was 2 stories with a jail in the basement and additional rooms for prisoners and the apartment of the jailer on the first floor and the courthouse on the second floor. This was all combined in one single building at that time. This is the only image that we have of that courthouse. Obviously, there was no photography at the time in order to be able to take pictures of the building, but the description was given in a history of Bradford County, and this drawing was made by Clement F. Heverly in 1923 based on those descriptions. And so you can see in this picture that it has an extension off from the end of the building on the ground level, and that was kind of the outdoor yard for the jail that was located in the basement of the building. The building was completed and occupied on January 9th, 1816 at a cost of $7,000, including $46.50 for whiskey and $4 for cider, both of which were very necessary for the men who were working on the building. And so you can see here a scan from the Commissioner's Minute books that state on January 6th of 1816, they were packing up and arranging the papers and books in the office in order to move to the new courthouse. And on January 9th, they were moving the papers to the courthouse. And so that's an interesting glimpse at that early history. Now, this was an advertisement for sealed proposals to build that stone jail yard located off the end of the building that I mentioned in the previous picture. This would be kind of what we might refer to as an exercise yard on the end of the building. And so the advertisement says, will be received at the Commissioner's office until the first Tuesday of July next for building a stone jail yard on the east side of the courthouse in the borough of Towanda, said yard to join up to the courthouse, to be of the same length and extend 25 feet towards the river, to be 14 feet high in the courthouse above the surface, and extend back in a horizontal line on the top, to be sunk into the ground 2 feet, to be 2 feet thick at bottom and 1.5 at top, plumb on the outside, firmly built of stone and laid in lime mortar, and the top covered with broken glass laid in lime cement. The builder to furnish all materials and complete the whole by the 1st of October next. No proposals will be opened until the time limited for receiving them has expired, when notice will be given to the person whose proposal is accepted immediately. And it's signed by the commissioners, and that was in 1831. The commissioners' minutes of March 12, 1847 said, this day the greatest fire occurred in Towanda that ever has been known in this section of the country. It broke out on Main Street between 1 and 2 o'clock p.m., and among other buildings, the courthouse and jail were burned. Here is this new wooden courthouse that had been built early on in the 1800s, and in 1847 it became part of a fire that burned down a large large portion of Towanda. Now, this is a good time to talk about the fact that during this fire, there were no records lost in the burning of the courthouse because the fire did not start on that site. It started in another building across the street. And so it worked its way toward the courthouse, and they had ample opportunity to remove all of the important records from the courthouse building before it burned. And fortunately, at that time, the amount of records was not as much as it is today. And so there wasn't as much to have to move in advance of the fire. And so, no, there were no records lost in the burning of the courthouse. An act was passed by the legislature on March 15, 1847, enabling the county to make a loan for the erection of new buildings. And so the document shown here is a document complete with signatures from residents of the county who are not pleased with the amount of tax that would be laid upon them to build the new courthouse. And it mentions Towanda needing to be equally liberal with the amount of money that they were contributing to the project as all of the other places. Again, the Commissioner's Minutes of June 25th, 1847 says, "This day, upon consideration and estimates made of the several proposals received for the building of a courthouse, except of those of C.L. Ward and George Means, they being for a certain sum for the whole building and not agreeing with the specifications were not considered, the Commissioners do adjudge John F. Means to be the lowest bidder and allot the work to him, considering his prices for the work to be fair and reasonable. This day also Sidney Hayden produced to the Commissioners an assignment of the bid of John F. Means to him, which is accepted by them." June 26, 1847. This day the Commissioners have entered into and executed a contract with Sidney Hayden for the erection of a courthouse, which is on file together with a bond from the said Hayden for a faithful performance on his part. So Sidney Hayden is being hired to build the new courthouse. So the new building was occupied in September of 1850. It cost $28,000, and the image that you see here is a lithograph from the 1858 map of Bradford County, and this is one of the earliest images of that new Bradford County Courthouse. Now, this would be located in a different position from the first courthouse. It would be located just a little bit north of the old courthouse and kind of in the parking lot that's located behind the present courthouse today. This image was the second image that was published of the building, this one in 1869 in Beers Atlas of Bradford County. And this shows for the first time the public park that was located in front of the building. So to give some context, the current courthouse sits right on top of that park that's shown in this picture. And so the second courthouse then was located, as I mentioned, directly behind that. This image was another drawing that was done in 1878. This appeared in Kraft's History of Bradford County, and again shows that park that was located in front of the second courthouse. And on either side of that courthouse are additional buildings. The building on the right is the brick building that still exists on the courthouse square today, and at that time it was built as an annex or a fireproof building in order to house additional records that could not fit in the second courthouse. This is one of the earliest pictures of the courthouse building, again showing the park in front and the design of the building, which now had a clock tower on top. Now, in this second courthouse there were 3 different levels, and again on the very bottom level you had a jail in order to house the prisoners. The jail, again, being in the same building with the courthouse. The problem with that, however, now is that the prisoners came to the conclusion that they could simply burn down the courthouse and escape from jail, and that in doing so they would be destroying county records and gaining their freedom. And so they made an attempt to destroy the second courthouse by fire. In 1867, a jailbreak occurred in which a prisoner beckoned the sheriff to come to his cell. I believe that he said he needed a light in order to read by or something of that nature. And when the sheriff opened the door to the cell, he threw the prisoner through some sort of chemical concoction in the eyes of the sheriff and managed to break out. and got out of the courthouse and got as far away as Leroy Township, where he walked into a hotel and heard people talking about the fact that someone had escaped from the county jail. And so he escaped back out the door of the hotel and went on down the road, and in fact started walking back toward Towanda, where he was caught and put back in jail. But all of this problem with prisoners trying to burn down the courthouse and break out of the courthouse, it led to the county commissioners deciding that the jail needed to be in a separate building, not in the same building as the courtrooms. And so that is when they began discussing the cost of building a separate jail in Towanda. And so land was purchased on Pine Street in Towanda, and in 1871 and 72 a new jail was built at a cost of $65,000, and that is the building that the Bradford County Historical Society's museum is currently in today. So now, for the first time in county history, there was a separate building for prisoners to be housed. In the front part of that jail building, the sheriff would live along with his family, and the sheriff would operate the jail. That has changed over time, where the sheriff doesn't operate the jail anymore. But back in those days, the sheriff would live there in the front part in the sheriff's house and operate the jail that was located in the back portion of the building. In this picture, you can see the jail located there to the right in the background, and the large building located in front of it. Executions were done in the jail at that location in the yard there, and that tall building standing in front of the jail allowed someone to get up on the roof and look down over the exercise yard wall and be able to yell down to the street what was going on whenever hanging was to be done. And people would come in from all parts of Bradford County on horses and buggies to get a glimpse of executions taking place. These are pictures of an execution that took place. This is the execution of Bigler Johnson. This one was in 1905. His brother was later executed as well a couple of years later, and these are the gallows. These were brought in on train as they were needed, and they were used at different locations, but whenever they were needed here, they were brought in and set up. And so this is kind of a before and after of the execution taking place. You can see there in the yard a number of people gathered. Some of them would be press people, but it was basically a first come, first serve to get in the door, to be able to stand in the yard and actually witness the execution take place. It was a sensational kind of an event back then, and people were very interested in seeing or hearing about it. That is why these photos were taken. In 1857 and 58, a new building was built for the Prothonotary and the Register and Recorder's Office. It was known as the Fireproof, and the building cost $7,500. And the reason for that is because after they built the second courthouse, it all of a sudden became not big enough to contain the growing county. By this time, we had coal mining going on in the county, railroading. People were making money. A lot of transactions were going on with properties and so on. The courthouse all of a sudden was too small to contain all of the records and the staff that was needed to process all of this. So they had to build an additional building to the right, and this is the building that is still there today, although the top has been slightly rebuilt, because when this was originally built, as you can see, the second floor windows were filled in, and the first floor was the only section that was being used. So later on, the second floor was finished off to create more space there as well. And I believe they did that for cost purposes, so they could get the building built and then come back and finish the rest later on. So this is a larger picture showing that image of that building in relation to the second courthouse, and you can see now the park with the trees that have developed there, and you can also see in the background a rail car right to the very right, and this illustrates how close the courthouse was to the railroad. Now in this picture you can see the canal there in the lower part of the picture, and you can see the courthouse and the annex building and the back portions of them. In this picture you can also see that in that annex building that the roof was actually built at an angle, and there was really only one floor of usable space in that building at that time. They would come back later on and build that into a second floor, but you can see at that time the windows are filled in on the second floor, and they're just fake windows at that time. In this picture you can see now they have added the second story into that building. there in the picture on the left. We're looking again at the back of the courthouse, and that annex there is on the left. But this illustrates how close that second courthouse was to the railroad. It sat right on the rail bed just about, and so trains going through would be a major interruption to court going on in the building. That annex building in later years would become the Bradford County Historical Society's first home. So you can see in this picture that the top has changed after the second floor was extended, and the museum was located in this facility to start off with after the third courthouse was built, which we will talk about in a minute. This is another picture of it taken later on in the 50s or 60s era, and this shows again the building. Although some of the windows are still closed in, the roof was raised up in order to provide enough space on the second floor to make it usable. On the other side of the second courthouse was another building that almost mirrored the annex that was on the right side, and in 1856 and 57 a building was built north of the courthouse to be used by the Franklin Fire Company. The basement was used by the county. The fire company moved out in 1963, and it was taken over by the county, and it burned in 1978, and the basement was used until 1985. Of course, that's no longer there today. But you can see an image of what that building was like shown there, and also the fire department picture at the bottom. Here's a photo of the Franklin Engine Company number 1 located in that building, and you can see a picture of that building there as it looked at that particular time. This shows that on top of that building there was a fire bell that was located there to alert the town of fires. And so this made a perfect location for a fire department to be located right next to the courthouse in case there was ever another fire like destroyed the first courthouse. Now, the county had other facilities, and so we're looking at the county farm or the county poorhouse or the almshouse. It had different names at different times, but this is a picture of that located over in the West Burlington area. This was located on the site of what is now the Bradford County Manor, but this building held people who were unable to take care of themselves. It also held a section of the building that held people who we would say today have mental disabilities, and the stories of how those people were cared for in those days are generally pretty sad, but this is how all of these types of homes operated at the time. Now, this was located on what was called the county farm, and on this farm, produce and things were actually raised, and food was used to support the county house there. And then across the road from that was a cemetery where people were buried, generally without any sort of a grave marker. People that might have passed away while living there in that facility were buried in that cemetery, and that cemetery still exists today up behind the Bradford County Jail. On top of this building, you can see it has a tower very much like the jail that was built at 109 Pine Street, kind of a lookout tower type situation. Today, this is the site of the Bradford County Manor. This is a picture of the manor when it was first built on that location. In 1870, Troy was made a half-shire town in order to service the residents of western Bradford County, and a courthouse was built in Troy in 1894, and court was later abolished there in 1923. So this is a picture of the courthouse that was built there in 1894, and the problem at that time was that the county of Bradford is so large, in fact the second largest in the state of Pennsylvania, that people had to travel a great distance to get to the courthouse at Towanda, even though it was central to the county. But the problem for the people in western Bradford County is that there was no direct railroad from there to Towanda, even though there was an effort later made to build a railroad from Canton all the way through to Powell and then connect in to the railroads there. That project never got finished. So if you were going to go to Towanda, you would either have to take horse and buggy, which would probably take quite a while to go on the roads. The roads were dirt and dust and mud quite often, and so it was a very difficult trip to get there that way. To get there by railroad meant you had to get on the train at Canton or Troy and go north up into New York and across and down from Sayre down to Towanda. So it was a very out-of-the-way, indirect route to get to the courthouse. People were frankly tired of doing that, and that is why this courthouse was created in 1894. And so inside this building you had the courtroom, and of course later on, after this stopped being used as a courthouse, it was later purchased by the school district in Troy, and the building was used for school activities, the second floor being turned into an auditorium, and other things being located in the building as well. So this is a picture of what the second floor of that building looks like today, which is closed off to the public, but this gives you an idea of the courtroom that was there. Now, of course, renovations were made to this room to turn it into more of a school auditorium type feel in later years, so it doesn't look exactly as it would have looked like as a courtroom, but at least you can see the layout of the seats and how that would have been for people attending court there. Now, an interesting thing happened in 1894. Clement F. Heverly, who also was the first librarian of the Bradford County Historical Society, he had a newspaper called the Bradford Star, and an interesting article was written by him in 1894 complaining about the prostitution that was going on in Towanda, and particularly around the Bradford County Courthouse at the time. So he wrote this article to bring to light what was going on, and I will read excerpts from it. And then there was a response to his article, which I will also read as well. Heverly wrote in 1894, "Never before was there a time when Towanda so much needed a cleansing as now. The woman in black is an object of innocence compared to the women in scarlet, who not only parade the streets of Towanda by night, but by day as well. When we say that our investigations determine that there are as many as 20 bedhouses and dens of pollution and 60 harlots in Towanda, we trust that our Christian people and town authorities will at once begin the work of reformation. There are 3 places, at least, that are notoriously bad. One is an underground rendezvous, where 15 of these harlots are known to have congregated in one night. The performances that have taken place there would shock the profane gods and make any being who had not fallen to the level of the brute turn away in disgust. At some of these places men have been robbed of their purses, watches, and jewelry, but there have never been arrests for the reason that these unfortunates have been unwilling to admit their own guilt. During court time, these scarlet women throng the courthouse looking for subjects and seat themselves among ladies. Many respectable women are called in court, and it is an insult to them to have these prostitutes, whom they do not know, occupying seats with them. Sometimes these common women are called in court as witnesses. Then, of course, they have a right there, and should be corralled by the tipstaffs. Otherwise, they have no business around the courthouse, and should not be permitted to remain there. We trust that Judge Peck will investigate the matter and order his tipstaffs, as some other judges in the state have done, to clear the room and grounds of all such women who are not wanted as witnesses." End quote. And so after Heverly published this article, he received a letter that was written in response to his article from a man who was not exactly pleased with what Heverly had written. Heverly begins with a short introduction, and then he decides to publish this letter exactly how it was written. Now, this person who wrote this letter in response to Heverly had apparently bad grammar, and so this letter was written in such a way that the words were phonetic spelling rather than the actual spelling, which makes it even more amusing to read. And so I will read that just as it was actually written in the newspaper. And I suspect Heverly reprinted it this way to make this person look like a fool. But it was nevertheless very interesting. And so this is what Heverly begins with. The title of the article says, "What Reuben Knows and Thinks About the Scarlet Women." While we do not agree with our Ulster correspondent this week, nevertheless, his communication shows what some men think on the subject treated in our last issue, and furnishes additional facts for an investigation. Signed, the editor. The letter reads this way. "Mr. Editor, well, now you have finally went and done it. I have been 'spectin' for quite a spell that you would do it. You've been knocking around so promiscuous lately. I expected just like as not you would tackle this women matter for long. I don't see what you wanted to do it for anyway. Just knock the boys out of all their fun. The other editors don't tell all they know about the women in the papers. They just keep still. I don't believe they tell their wives all they know about them. I wish these women would give you a ticket to let you in for nothing, the way the fair folks did to the other editors, so you keep still too. I don't see what there is to complain about anyway. You have got a great big town down there, and lots of men have to come there to tend court and be jurymen and do lots of business. I don't see as 60 of them women as any more than you need there. I'd like to know what you expect them jurymen going to do when they have to come there and stay a whole week. If 'twasn't for these women, a feller would get awful lonesome down there, and our treasurer, he would get out of practice tending baby if he didn't find anything to hold on his lap for a whole week. You see, there is two ways of looking at this thing. You fellers that stay right to home all the while don't understand the ins and outs of this matter so well as we do who live in the country. I don't see how you calculate that folks is going to come to your town if you don't hold out no inducements to 'em. Lots of the big towns are advertising their living pictures on exhibition to draw folks to 'em, and I don't see how you can get along without some too. The way you're acting, a feller can't see no more live pictures down there. I don't think you like pictures much, else you wouldn't act that way. You ought to go into the Senate Saloon some night and see what pretty pictures they keep down there, and all alive too. It won't cost you only 25 cents to see 'em, and you can go up through an alley and just give a little tap on the back door and you can get in, and they ain't a bit stingy about it neither, and you can see the whole picture. They are awful pretty pictures. They beat anything Mr. Columbus had in his show out to Chicago. You talk about ruining the young men. I don't see how you figure it that way. The boys can learn more about physiology in the Senate in one night than they can learn up to the Institute in a whole term. I see lots of them in there one night studying like fury. It 'pears to me you are too promiscuous about finding so much fault with these women. You talk just as though you thought they was all alike, but they ain't, 'cause some is bigger than the rest. Don't you see, if you had your way, you would knock all the life out of your town, and we would all have to go to Monroe to do our business. If it wasn't for these women, what would the liquor men do for custom? And if they have to quit business, then the lawyers couldn't get no license for 'em, and the county would lose a big lot of money every year, and the men who own the houses couldn't rent 'em, and the police wouldn't have no job, and the justice of the peace wouldn't have nothing to do, and we wouldn't want no more quarter of session of court, and there wouldn't be no more divorces, and things would be out of joint all around. Don't you see, there is two sides to this women matter, and it makes a heap of odds where you be when you look at 'em. It is a great big thing for a little feller like you to tackle, and afore you write any more stuff about them scarlet women, you had better ask the boys about it and see if they be willin'. You have got all our wives up onto their ears about it now, and when I got home from work the other night, my wife Sarah, she said she shouldn't let me go to Towanda again so long as I live, but I can fix that. For you see, I will get Jerry Collins to stick my name into the jury box, and then I must go, you see. I tell you, I just like to slip the halter and come to town now and then. It makes me feel so I was just as young as I used to be. Signed, Reuben. The interesting thing about this story is that Clement Heverly was actually arrested because he mailed out his newspaper with that letter reprinted in it. And actually, I have edited out some more graphic parts of the letter. And so he was arrested, and they claimed that he was violating postal law, that he was sending out filth through the United States Postal Service. So at this point, the commissioners were starting to look at the need to have a much larger courthouse. As I mentioned previously, the second courthouse was already too small as soon as they had built it, and they had to add an additional annex building. But that didn't last long, and they needed to have more space. Certainly by the 1890s, the county had just exploded in growth. There just was not room enough for everything that needed to go on now inside the courthouse. So in this picture, you see surveyors, including Hiram Bull, who are surveying the park area in front of the second courthouse to build the third courthouse, which is the courthouse that still stands today. You can see in the picture that trees are being cut down, the lot is being cleared, and they're preparing to build the new building. So the way that this would work is the new building would be located right on top of the park, would be built directly in front of the second courthouse, and as soon as the new courthouse would be built and they transferred everything that they needed over to the new courthouse, then the second courthouse would be torn down. This is a scan from a survey book that belonged to Hiram Bull, showing his notations of the survey that was done for the new courthouse. Probably he was carrying this book in that picture we just looked at. This was his preliminary outline of where the courthouse would be located there on that lot. So you can see in this picture that as the surveying is going on, the trees are being cut down there in the front of the picture, that the front section of the courthouse is being torn off. That portico on the front section is being torn off to make room for building the courthouse. The back of the courthouse was going to come right up next to the front of that second courthouse as it was being built. This is kind of a close-up of that section of the building being torn off. You can see there's a man up inside of there working and tearing this section of the courthouse apart. The architects were Lehman and Schmidt, and you can see some examples here of other buildings they built, and you can see some similarities in those buildings to the courthouse that we now have today. You can see very similar architectural type features. This is another Jewish temple that they built in Cleveland, Ohio. And this is their plan for the Bradford County Courthouse, the third courthouse. Now, there are certainly some differences between this plan and what was finally built. You can notice, particularly with the rotunda area that's on the top, some significant differences were made to that. The square base of it, it's not so round as it is today. They are showing that there would be a flagpole on top of the rotunda area and that the statue of Lady Justice would be on the front peak above the front doors, and that was actually reversed. They're showing detail around the top of the roof that does not exist, and they're showing a much more prominent entry on the side of the building, and presumably also another one on the other side as well. And this entry is actually running through both the basement level and the main floor, making it quite large, and I would assume that that was probably removed to make more space inside the building. The cornerstone was laid on September 7th, 1896, and included a copper box inside with the following contents. Number 1, a copy of all newspapers published in the county. 2, a copy of all the New York and Philadelphia newspapers that were received there on Monday. 3, a copy of the court calendar and of the last Troy term. 4, last annual report of receipts and expenditures of the county. 5, a photograph of the old courthouse with the date of its erection. 6, silver dollar, 50-cent piece, 25-cent piece, a nickel, a copper, penny, all of 1896. A gold dollar dated 1856 and a half dime from 1852. 7, a copy of the Bradford Argus dated January 8th, 1848, which was taken out of one of the pillars of the old courthouse. Number 8, names of the county officers, attorneys, architects, contractors, and the advisory committee. All of this was placed in that copper box inside the cornerstone. The cornerstone is located in the lower left corner of the building when you're looking at the front of the building and is still there today. This is a picture of the courthouse being built. You can see the rotunda on top. You can see that Lady Justice has been put in place. If you wonder how she got up there to start with, you can see that Lady Justice was actually hoisted up there inside the building and placed in a position before the roof was finished. And that's how they got her up there. You can see the windows have not been put in, they're boarded up, but you can see the main masonry work appears to be finished at this time. They're just getting the roof put on. You can see on the main roof, you can see through it, and so therefore the roofing has not been put on there yet. The statue on the dome is a representation of the Greek Titaness Themis, protector and defender of justice and fairness. So you can see that in this close-up. And this picture shows the courthouse after it was completed some years later, and you can see that at that time there was no monument in the front for the Civil War yet. So when the courthouse was finished, it was located directly in front of the second courthouse. And this is a very interesting picture that shows the two courthouses standing one in front of the other. You can see the difference in size between the second courthouse and the new one, which is the one that we know today. So again, once the third courthouse was completed, the second courthouse was then torn down. This is a close-up of the belfry on the second courthouse, and you can see that the shutter has been taken out in this picture. This is the same picture where they're taking off the front portico roof, and so they are preparing to take the bell out of this courthouse and to save it. Now, when the courthouse was finished, there was a lot of people angry about the cost of what the final product ended up being. So there was a lot of newspaper articles written by Clement Heverly as to his opinions of problems with the new courthouse building. He writes, quote, "Let us enter into a fuller examination of this costly structure. Viewing the building from Main Street, the beholder is impressed with two things. First, that the building is too low and squatty, being illy proportioned for its size. And second, that the front wall has been ruined in the process of cutting the stone, wherein the face surface is stained so deeply that it will always be necessary to keep the front of the building whitewashed to give it a respectable appearance. This detracts greatly from the beauty of the outside finish, and will be a constant expense to the county. While so much is being said of Mr. Bradley's having done all the work upon honor, we would like to know why he was permitted to put up such a disgraceful front, when the stones were to have been dressed smooth and correspond in color to the rest of the walls. There is but one explanation. He could cut the stones cheaper with saws than with the hammer and chisel, there being no difference made in cost to the county. It is a most miserable botch, and 9 out of every 10 will say so. Already the building is settling, and should it continue at the same rate for many months, it would become dangerous. On the east end or lower side of the building last week, there were great cracks between many of the joints, and in some cases, fully 1/4 of an inch in width. At one point, a crack extended upward many feet. However, to hide these defects from the public, the worst have since been plastered and cemented over. Evidence of the settling of the building may also be seen on the east side, where cracks may be found. A further proof is the cracking of the mosaic work at the front entrance, also in the grand jury room and basement, where the floors, put down at an extra cost of $2,500, are almost ruined, despite the fact that the whitewashers have been at work here filling up the cracks. In the east room of the superintendent's office, the floor has settled more than 1/4 of an inch. From the vast sum of money that has been expended, is it any wonder that these faults are being hid from the public? Upon entering the courthouse, the first thing that attracts the attention of the observer is the rotunda, the main part of the building, costing enough to have paid for the erection of a suitable courthouse, and being of no benefit whatever. After walking around, for you cannot sit down, and gazing at the charms of this great unoccupied space, ask yourself the question, what is all this for? Then pass into the little pinched-up courtrooms. Then you will see how wise the building has been planned and how your comforts have been provided for. Let us first take a look at the main courtroom, where court is now being held. The first thing that impresses us is the size of the room. It is entirely too small to accommodate the public, having only about 1/2 the seating capacity of the old courtroom. Last week, many people left the building in disgust because there was no place for them to see or hear in the courtroom, being overcrowded. The general arrangement of the whole room is very bad. The entrance and exit for the audience should have been at the rear of the room instead of the side. The seats should have been arranged on an incline, giving persons in the back part of the room an opportunity of seeing and hearing without stretching their necks out of joint. The acoustic properties of the room are abominable, it being almost impossible to hear across the room. In fact, persons who sat midway in the courtroom last week said it was difficult to hear witnesses and attorneys during the trial of cases. A great and serious defect is the ventilation of both courtrooms. In the main courtroom, fresh air is supplied through openings under 2 windows by a downward circuit, while there were 5 openings near the floor for the foul air to be drawn out. It will thus be seen that the provisions for receiving air into the room are entirely inadequate, and that the effect must be injurious on one occupying the room for any length of time. Last week, jurors, witnesses, and spectators complained of poor ventilation, some being so stifled with foul air as to be compelled to leave the room and to avoid sickness. One attorney in particular complained of being made sick by the condition of the room. The ventilation of courtroom number 2 is still much worse than that in the larger one. Here there is only one opening for the reception of fresh air. While court was being held in this room, many complained bitterly of the evil effects arising from foul air. Even an officer of the court said the condition of the room was such that he could hardly endure it. This week, a professional gentleman who has been spending some time in the larger courtroom and is an expert on the subject of ventilation said that the room was very badly ventilated. The jury boxes are too small and cramped and unhandy to be reached by jurors. The witness box is cumbersome and unsuitable, and all witnesses have to walk through the bar to take their seat. Besides the judge, the only officer provided for is the prothonotary. The stenographer has not been given so much as a stand to work on, and there is no place for the clerk of orphans' court. The entire space in front of the judge's desk is taken up by the prothonotary, who is made to appear a more important factor than the court himself. There is no cloakroom or place for coats or hats for members of the bar or jurors. The retiring room is badly located, and attorneys and witnesses must pass through the entire courtroom to reach it. Here, then, are some of the advantages and conveniences provided in a courthouse costing over $250,000 that do not begin to compare with the old courthouse put up at an expense of only $28,000. It is no wonder that the denunciations we heard last week were loud and bitter. And so during an inspection of the building after it was completed, Judge Benjamin Peck wrote these comments. I do not approve of sizes of footings of rear walls and supports of dome and for 13-inch walls. The side walls have concrete footings 12 inches thick and 4 feet wide, which gives approximately 3,900 pounds per square foot on the soil, which is probably sufficient, although the walls resting on these footings are capable of carrying several times as much load. The rear wall has the same size footings, which gives about 4,900 pounds per square foot on soil, which in my judgment will produce settlement in this location. The slate roof is open to the objection that if a slate is broken, the leak caused would enter the building direct, and no thickness of slate is given. I fear also condensation from variations of temperature between exterior and air in the attic. Clement Heverly particularly disliked Mile Lilly, who was the prothonotary of Bradford County at the time, and who he claimed influenced the commissioners in spending a great deal of money on this project. Heverly wrote, quote, the people of this county have been grossly wronged in the great debt that has been placed upon them by the building of a courthouse, an imperfect affair costing over $250,000. A few politicians are to blame for this debt being forced upon the taxpayers in these most trying times. One above all others has made himself active and officious in this pernicious piece of work. That individual is Boss Lilly, or the Lord of the new courthouse. First, he run the old Board of Commissioners in the preliminary arrangements for the new courthouse. He then succeeded in getting himself on the advisory committee, advocated a costly building, and the worst kind of a plan. Self-conceited and ostentatious, he knew more than all the other members of the committee, and practically had everything his own way. He was not content in bossing the commissioners, but we are told by other members of the committee that he even made the architect and contractor bend to his way of thinking. In other words, he bossed the job and made a miserable botch of the whole thing. He picked the best part of the building for himself and had it furnished like a parlor fit for a king. In both courtrooms, he took more space than is given to the judge and crowded out the clerk of orphans' court and stenographer. Now, this is an architectural rendering of what the judge's bench in courtroom number 1 was to look like, also showing the witness stand at the right. Now, you can see in this picture of county employees taken in 1948 that down to the left side of the picture is what was originally intended to be the prothonotary's desk. And among Clement Heverly's complaints about the courthouse building project was that Mr. Lilly, Mile Lilly, had created a section for himself that was much bigger than any other area and even rivaled the judge's bench itself, he said, and excluded others that needed to have space in the courtroom as well. In this picture, also of county elected officials, you can see the original lights that were mounted on the judge's bench and also on that desk again in the front. Today, those have been removed. So there was such anger among county residents over the cost of the courthouse that the taxpayers of Bradford County filed an appeal, and Judge Robert W. Archibald of Scranton was to preside over the appeal against the report of the county auditors for 1896. In that report, they had visited the courthouse and gave a favorable opinion of the building and the expenses. The appeal lasted from December 1897 until February of 1898, and an interesting thing about Judge Archibald is that later on in his career in 1912, he would be impeached because he was convicted of, quote, improperly soliciting and accepting gifts from litigants and attorneys, entering into agreements with litigants at substantial benefit to himself and allowing a corrupt jury selection process, end quote. And that was on cases that had taken place at other locations that was not connected to this courthouse case. But nevertheless, it was interesting that that occurred a little over a decade after this courthouse case in Bradford County. So the purpose of the appeal was to determine whether it was legal for the commissioners to enter into additional contracts that caused the courthouse project to nearly double in price. And projects that the commissioners had added included the raising of the elevation by 1 foot of the grounds of the courthouse because the building was too low, a change in the type of granite for the columns on the front porch, and the addition of mosaic tile to the front porch and marble to the ceiling. Thomas Bradley was the contractor on the courthouse project. The cut glass windows that are in the courtroom to this day between the courtroom and the rotunda area were the first favor that contractor Bradley asked of the commissioners. It was his feeling that he wanted to beautify that area by adding a little bit nicer windows than what had been planned. I think the original idea was to just have plate glass windows there. He wanted to have cut glass windows. So he offered to put them in at cost to him, and it was testified that they were only pressed glass, but Bradley said that this was false and that they were genuine cut glass from Corning, costing $7 per square foot. Charles Chilson, a laborer, testified that he had applied, quote, White House paste, end quote, to the front of the building, made of cement, lime, salt, and water to cover the rust stains that were caused by sawing the stone with an iron saw instead of by hand. Whitewashing had only washed off during the rain, and acid had been used on the front steps to remove the rust, but this was also a failure. And so work was done in cutting the stone, but it was done improperly, and as a result of it being done improperly, it had caused staining that should not have been there. And in order to cover that up, this material that they refer to as White House paste was slathered over top of the stone to try to hide the iron stains. The mosaic tile in the basement cracked shortly after installation. When this floor was removed in 1997, it was discovered that the basement had been used to dump masonry waste, such as bits of terracotta building tiles, limestone, brick, etc. This, along with the fact that the concrete had been poorly and cheaply poured and was very thin, likely caused the cracks. During the testimony of ex-Commissioner Green, he broke down twice, and a recess had to be taken more than once to allow him to regain his composure. At one point, he sobbed aloud as he told of his struggles to make a success of his business life and his sorrow at being charged at the age of 68 years with wrongdoing. He resented vehemently any attempt to impeach his integrity. So the commissioners were put on the stand and questioned over the decisions that they had made. Edward Overton was the attorney representing the taxpayers of Bradford County, and he would ultimately win his case. On the final day of arguments in this trial, the newspaper reported, at 10:45, Mr. Overton began his closing remarks in answer to the defendant's counsel. He reiterated his belief that fraud existed and that pressure was brought to bear upon the contractor to such an extent that he paid money to Schmidt, who was the architect, and that others also received rewards. He cited Supreme Court decisions sustaining his contention that the commissioners had no right to delegate their powers, and reviewed in a scathing manner the methods by which the commissioners, contractor, and architects made contracts. And the conclusion of this case was that the judge found in favor of the taxpayers of Bradford County, and the three commissioners ended up paying $11,000 of their own money back to the county for decisions that they had made that were over and above the necessary expenses for the building. Now, the actual price that they had gone over was around $37,000, but the judge only found that they were responsible themselves for $11,000. Clement Heverly was quite proud of his reporting that he had done in bringing to light the corruption that he felt had been engaged in by the commissioners. He wrote, "Much credit is due Colonel E. Overton and L. M. Hall, the able attorneys of the taxpayers, for the courage and ability with which they have fought this case to a finish, and also to Job Morley of Burlington, who generously advanced the funds to pay the necessary expenses of the litigation. The Star also takes no little pride in the part which we have taken in winning this fight for the taxpayers of Bradford County. We firmly believe that if we had not exposed the conduct of the county officers and called the attention of the public to the way in which the people were being robbed, there would have been no investigation, and the taxpayers would have never known of the wrong which had been perpetrated upon us." This picture shows the courthouse now with the Civil War monument in front of it, the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. In 1896, the foundation foundation of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument was laid, and the monument was dedicated on November 26, 1901. The monument cost $18,000. The veterans raised that money in order to have that monument put there. Now, these are examples of postcards showing the courthouse, and these are hand-colored postcards, and they're interesting because there are various things shown in the pictures that were not actually there when the pictures were taken. If you observe the picture in the upper right corner, you'll see that in the background, in the lower left, you'll see a building behind the courthouse, and there was no such building that existed behind the courthouse at that point in time. I can only imagine that the artist must have thought that it would be easier to just put a building there than to try to depict the river in the background. And then up on the flagpole, he has drawn in a flag flying on the pole, when apparently there was not one on the pole at that time. In the lower left postcard, you can see a car has been drawn in, also a flag on the pole again. Another building is in the background on the left, and then the postcard again in the lower right corner, there is another large building in the background that did not exist. In this picture of the courthouse, we see the cannons that were on either side of the building. Now, the courthouse cannons were brought from a federal arsenal along with the Gatling guns in the courthouse entry in 1907 or 1908 through the efforts of George Kipp of Towanda. And those cannons ended up being scrapped in the World War I scrap drive, but the Gatling guns are still located inside the entry of the courthouse. The courthouse has been the site of many public gatherings over the years, especially during wartime and other patriotic holidays and events. Many parades were held in front of the courthouse. This is an example of one of them, but the courthouse always shows up in many of these pictures. This picture shows the courthouse during the Welcome Home celebration that was held at the end of World War I when Bradford County soldiers returned home. This is a side view of the courthouse at that time in the way it was decorated for this event, and then further pictures of the courthouse during the parade. And you can also see the stand that was set up right in front of the front doors where speeches were made during that event. This is a welcome home event held in front of the courthouse for World War II soldiers. You can see the courthouse is decorated again for that. And then also in the courthouse lawn was this service board that listed the men from Towanda who had served in World War II. This is a swearing-in ceremony for men who were entering the Army in 1961. This was held in front of the courthouse as well. And we have a cow judging contest going on in front of the courthouse in this picture. Now, the courthouse square was used for an event called Bradford County Old People's Day that was held by the Bradford County Historical Society, and this was held from around 1903 up until the 1930s. And this picture was taken inside courtroom number 1. You can see an audience there is watching, and they would honor people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s during this event, and they would have a program there in courtroom number 1. The Bradford County Historical Society in 2012, during the bicentennial of the county, had the same event there that day, and we conducted a program there in courtroom number 1, just as they had done several years ago. This is another picture from Old People's Day later on, where they were singing songs in the side lawn of the courthouse, and another picture from that event. This picture was taken in 1967 and is interesting because it shows some things that are not there anymore. First of all, the ivy growing all over the side of the building, something that is no longer there, and also the power lines that are in front of the building that have been since removed and put underground. Now, in the 1980s and early 90s, a 3-phase renovation took place at the courthouse. Beginning in 1985 with Phase 1, which included a number of projects around the grounds, stonework, making repairs to the Lady Justice statue on top of the building, fixing some terracotta tiles on the roof, removing the foundation of the old fire hall that had burned down to the left of the courthouse years before that. In 1988 and 89, Phase 2 occurred. This included significant 3rd and 4th floor renovations, installation of the elevator in the rear stairwell tower installation of all new bathrooms with hot water, which was the first time in the history of the building that hot water was introduced. All of the old sinks and marble wainscoting from the original bathrooms were reused where possible. They installed central HVAC on the 3rd and 4th floors, relocated and realigned many offices, and enlarged. The building was updated to meet current safety standards at that time by installing central smoke alarm systems, fire hoses, emergency lighting and generator, new electrical entrances and service panels, and the upgrading of electrical wiring throughout the building. They also found an interesting thing while in the process of building the addition for the elevator tower, and that was the foundation of the second courthouse was located during excavation, and it was located approximately 6 feet below the finished level of the current parking lot, and it appeared that the foundation walls were laid field stone and that someone had used the basement of the old courthouse for a pit to burn the remains that were not removed, since there were reported to be a lot of coal and ashes found in that area. And then in 1992, a renovation and restoration took place of courtroom number 1. That courtroom had been damaged as a result of water that had been leaking in on the roof above. And so since the roof had been repaired during the previous renovation, they now went back in and were able to restore the damage that had been done. During this improvement, they removed a lot of green paint from the walls, which had been applied back in the 60s, and returned it back to its original look. The room had been generally neglected up until this time, so a lot of cleanup, a lot of work was done in courtroom number 1. And as mentioned earlier, in 1997, the basement floor was completely removed and completely redone. Now, the most recent renovation was replacement of the roof, and so the terracotta tiles were taken off and copper roofing was put on both the main roof and on the rotunda area. Repairs were made up on the rotunda and with the Lady Justice statue. These are some of the most recent renovations completed at the Bradford County Courthouse. So I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening to learn a little bit more about the Bradford County Courthouse and the Courthouse Square and the unusual story that has developed there over the years. If you enjoyed this video, we would request that you share this with someone else, and so that more people can learn about our local history, and also support the Bradford County Historical Society by becoming a member or donating, which you can do at www.bradfordhistory.com. And that helps us preserve the materials that tell the history of our county. Thanks again.